Was My Heart and Other Black Holes. Great title. Was that the first book that you wrote, or did you have to write a couple before you got to the point where you had something?
Yeah, it was most certainly not the first book that I wrote. I wrote a lot of other books, and I wrote a lot of half-finished other books. Like, a big part of my problem was when I was first starting out, and to this day is still a little bit of a problem, is that I idea hop. And I think the thing about idea hopping is you never see that the new idea is also going to be really difficult when you get to the middle of it, right? But you always, or I did, always hopped when I reached that 50 to 75 page part where you really got to do the work. You got to grind it out, and you have to figure out like how you're going to keep the story going, or, you know, what is going on, not just that kind of sparkly beginning that seemed so fun. And so I did that a lot, and I was writing a lot of more like whimsical middle grade books. And My Heart and Other Black Holes was a big departure in style for me, which has been interesting for my publishing journey, because I think what your debut book is kind of sets the tone for what people expect that your body of work is going to be like in a lot of ways. But it was one of my first like young adult books that I'd worked on. So, and I know that like line can be blurry sometimes, right? Like I think of my middle grade books, my Other Words for Home and The Shape of Thunder, as being more like tween books. So that's like kind of like junior high, you know, like I think of them as like maybe 4th grade and up, 5th grade and up type middle grade. Like middle grade's a big span, right? We could have listeners here who are 1st grade. Then that encompasses some middle grade books. But My Heart and Other Black Holes is pretty firmly a YA book, like a high school book. And but all of my other books before that really had been middle grade books. But it was, you know, I started writing the book in the last semester of my MFA program in January 2013. And it was a book that was born out of, you know, personal life experiences. So that book would not have been written and could not have been written without what was happening in my life happening. But it was very different from anything that I had ever worked on, which again, I think just the way a publishing career can happen or take place is interesting in that way. And that, yeah, it's not like I'd written a bunch of other darker YA books that hadn't worked and then came to My Heart and Other Black Holes. It was very different from anything I'd worked on before.
So how long from the time you sit down and say, all right, every morning it's on, I'm doing this, to what's the first step? Do you get an agent? Do you get when that positive news comes through, what is the positive news?
Yeah, so I've been writing, trying to get published. I mean, I don't know, like writing with the intention that I wanted to be published for 3 years before I started writing My Heart and Other Black Holes in January 2013. And then I wrote My Heart and Other Black Holes crazy fast. I have never written another book this fast, and I never, ever again will, I'm sure of it. But I finished this draft March 2013, revised it, query agents in May of 2013, and I signed with my agent in the first week of June of 2013, and she'd sold the book by, I think the official date that the deal closed was August 2013, so it was a really fast kind of publishing fairy tale type moment for that particular book. But there had been these years before it of, you know, writing things and not finishing things, and probably prematurely querying the projects that I did, because I would be like make that new writer mistake of being really excited about something, really excited I finished, and like querying, be like, oh, maybe they'll see the potential in it and they'll help me edit it, you know, which is, you know.
I like your version of publishing. I want to live in that world.
Yes, exactly. And so it was also my first project, though, that I took the revision part of it very seriously before I approached agents. So if anyone's listening here who's a writer themselves trying to get published, that's always one of my number one pieces of advice, is to revise and revise and revise until you can't think of a single thing you would change about the book. And I think that was a big mistake I made as a young writer, is that I'd always be like, it's good enough, like it's a good idea, they'll see, and then I won't make changes they don't want. I'll be able to change it the way they do want. You know, I like always had all these excuses. But I think that comes from, we all have that, right? That like thirstiness to be published. And I definitely felt that. And I think the longer that I've been in this, the more I'm interested in making sure it's the story that I really want to tell, as opposed to feeling like I just want to publish another book, which has been an interesting, I think, evolution maybe that happens once you have that moment of seeing, you know, your book on a bookshelf, which was always the dream and is still astounding to me that it happened. It's really special every time. Tomorrow I'm going to go and want to see the new book on the shelf. So of course it's still exciting and I want that. But I think that that itchiness of like over eagerness I've been able to calm that a little bit. And I think that that has served my writing better, to be able to like sit with things a little bit longer and realize that it's not about like how fast you can do something, but more, are you doing something the best that you can do it.
So what helped you get over that? It's a common thing that to fall apart in the middle, or just, you know, hit a spot where you don't know where you're going anymore. And when you get an idea, does it come to you as a 3-act structure? You know the whole thing. Do you sit down and plot it all, or is it all just as it comes to you?
It's all, it definitely does not have a structure. I don't even think some of my published books have 3-act structures. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say that on this podcast, but like I never think in 3-act structure. I don't really understand 3-act structure, to be honest. That's not how my brain works. I think in terms of like satisfying feel for story, like I want the story to feel like I think in terms of character growth, like I'm a character-based writer. And so for me, it's always, my idea is start with a character who's asking something about the world, about a problem they have. And the book is built around that question. And kind of by the end of the book, I think the book usually leaves you with more questions as opposed to answering that question, but somehow the character has grown and learned things along the way that have complicated that question. But when my first book came out, I was lucky enough, I got sent on book tour. And one of the other writers who I was on tour with she wrote a high fantasy novel that was wonderful. Like I read it in one night. I loved this book. But I was listening to her on the panel and she was talking about like 3-act structure. I was also talking about all these different plot beats. And I had like a nervous breakdown to her at dinner. I was like, I don't know any of those things. Like, what is this? And she was very reassuring and was like, I've read your book and you do know those things, because I can break your book down that way. I think you just are thinking about story differently. And I think that that's the other thing that I had to learn, is like, you are the writer that you are, as opposed to sometimes the writer you want to be. Like, I wish that I was more of a plotter. And I wish that structure was easier for me to understand. It wasn't something that I had to like grope so much around in the dark to be able to find. But I think that like she said to me, which was really comforting, that you learn these things through reading, right? And I think that that is one thing I feel really confident in, is that I read all the time and have always been a super voracious reader. And that's how I've learned about writing. So I don't plot my books, and I couldn't hang with you in a conversation about structure, honestly, if we were asking about different points of it. So I definitely don't really think about that a lot when I'm writing my book. So I'm sure my editor does, and she helps to guide me. My poor editor, she's like, why are you saying you don't think about structure, know about structure on a podcast? But I mean, it's true. I'm interested, I guess, in character and in character growth. And I guess that's a different way to think about plot. But I sort of think about all the other things that make it so you have to have a plot without so much thinking about that, if that makes sense.
It does. I think you can absolutely keep up in a conversation about structure with me. Now, if Robert McKee were here, watch out. That's a different conversation. And I imagine there's probably somebody listening to us or watching us who they are Jasmine Warga, and they're hearing the terms plot and structure like, oh my gosh, no, I could never do that. And they're going to hear you and like, well, look, she's a Newbery Honor winner. For God's sake, if she's not bothered by not embracing plot and structure first, but starting with character, maybe it's okay that I do as well. And I always make the joke that if I have two really successful writers back to back tell me that we do exactly this every time and it's always successful, I'm throwing out everything I know about writing and I'm doing that. But so far it hasn't happened.
Yeah,